Hi, my name is Krisha Pillai, and I'm going to give a Proposition 1 on the first motion on failed states. I'd first like to thank the committee for taking the time to listening to this speech. And again, this will be Proposition 1 of about 7.5 minutes. During times of total collapse, when governments stop functioning, institutions disappear, and people are left without food, medicine, or protection, citizens of failed states suffer. Not because of who they are, but because the world chooses to look away. Because we on Side Proposition believe that the international community has a moral duty to step in when a state fails its people, so proud to propose the motion, this House believes that the international community should govern failed states. In the speech, just two things. I'll first offer our framework, and then our first two substantive arguments. My partner will introduce the third. So then first on definitions. 1, we think a failed state is a nation that can no longer perform basic functions of government, per what the info slide gives us. Examples of these failed states include Haiti, Syria, and Afghanistan. Second, the international community refers to the broad collective of countries, but in this case, we think groups like the UN General Assembly or regional coalitions would likely step in. Third, to govern, we think, means to conduct the policy, actions, and affairs of. This would look like multilaterally supporting these failed states and making decisions where the international community would hold the majority of decision-making power, but there would still be representation from the failed state if they are deemed fit to govern, to ensure that they can transition back to governing by themselves after. But then for stance. On proposition, we believe that in the case of failed states, the international community has a moral obligation to step in and provide temporary governance. This means not only deploying peacekeeping missions, but overseeing reconstruction, supporting the reestablishment of domestic leadership, and governing these states when the states themselves have failed to do so. We think this would be temporary, as even countries in the UN are going to have finite resources, but would continue until the failed state can fulfill government responsibilities. We think these countries would work collaboratively and divide responsibilities to respect local context. But what is the alternative on the opposition? We think without any governance, these states would continue to be ravaged by corruption, economic collapse, and humanitarian crises. Then the burden on the opposition is to prove that international intervention causes more harm than the ongoing collapse without it in order to win today's debate. But then, our first substantive is on the global welfare theory. We think that every human being, regardless of what country they were born in, deserves a functioning state that respects and protects their rights. Two moral frameworks to evaluate this under. First being Kant's doctrine of global citizenship, which tells us that people should not just be provided rights based on their place of citizenship or individual status, but based on the fact that they're citizens of the world. The second layer under this is Rawls' natural lottery theory. The lottery of birth describes that aspects such as race, class, gender, and location are simply morally arbitrary because they are not selected intentionally, but based off of the lottery of where one happens to be born. Therefore, since rights transcend borders according to these theories, the people who are living in these failed states deserve the same rights as people who live in more privileged nations. If a state cannot uphold these rights, the international community then has a duty to act. But then what is the violation on this? Our first one is a lack of governance. The fact that a state is failed and doesn't have the infrastructure to support its people means that the international community has a moral obligation to do so on a principled level. Then, the basic rights of the people in these states, like access to food, water, and security, are violated when the government doesn't have the infrastructure to support them, or when violence runs rampant. Without real administrative structures, these missions, or like simple supports that opposition may advocate for, only scratch the surface. Sovereignty cannot justify an action when a state has already lost legitimacy and control. Look at the 3.2 million Afghans who are displaced inside their country due to conflict. The international community then must step in not to control, but to temporarily protect and rebuild. Our second substantive then is on human rights. The thesis of this argument is that international governance is essential in failed states to prevent the rise of terrorism by filling power vacuums, restoring order, and protecting civilians from extremist groups that exploit the absence of authority. Our first layer here is on the prevention of terrorism. When there are unstable governments or an absence of one, we've historically seen power vacuums when terrorist groups then rise. We saw this in Syria, for example, when the breakdown of central authority during the civil war allowed groups like ISIS and al-Nusra Front to gain territory and control over civilians, fueling humanitarian crises. Or in 2023, after Haiti's government failed to conduct a democratic election, gang violence rose up, overpowering the police. The presence of these international countries deters extremist actors and protects civilians from being exploited when there are no other laws to govern what's happening. Just providing structure and the infrastructure allows to keep sectarian violence and terrorist groups in check. Or second, their presence there stops there from being a power gap that terrorist groups seek to fill through their violent actions. We can see that this stabilized Kosovo, for example. After, in 1999, ethnic conflict devastated Kosovo, the UN launched a mission there to govern the region. They rebuilt courts, restored services, and helped set up its first democratic elections. Today, Kosovo is a functioning democracy, proving that international governance can stabilize failed states. Our second layer here is on shutting down bad actors. International governance is the only realistic way to confront corrupt actors who thrive in failed states. Failed states often result from leaders who abuse power, loot national wealth, and suppress opposition. So once a system of power collapses, those same elites often try to hold on through violence or manipulation. But without a functioning legal system, there's nothing to stop these corrupt leaders. However, the international community can enforce legal policies like sanctioning individuals, prosecute war crimes, and block stolen assets in international banks. In South Sudan, for example, government leaders used state-owned oil companies to enrich themselves while millions starved, and nothing happened until the international community stepped in. Our third mechanization here is on preventing economic collapse. International governance is crucial to preventing or reversing economic collapse, because when governments fail, so do markets. Banks shut down, inflation spirals, and basic goods like food become unaffordable. However, we've seen that temporary international governance can issue new currency, regulate markets, and work with global organizations like the IMF or World Bank to provide debt relief. For example, in East Timor, after they got independence, the UN helped issue a stable currency to attract foreign investors and rebuild industries. The impact more broadly, though, is that economic collapse directly translates to human rights abuses. When families cannot afford food, children have to work instead of being educated, families are forced to seek refuge, and people cannot afford basic services like healthcare, leading to increased debts. But because we believe that the international community must step in to rebuild these countries that have so badly failed their citizens, so proud to continue to propose. Thank you.